our rules. You are illegally parked.
I pay exorbitant fees here. Get this clamp off my car now.
There are certain kinds of people who think a clipboard, a badge, or a laminated rule sheet suddenly makes them the ruler of the universe. And this story is exactly about one of those moments where that illusion gets completely shattered. Imagine spending thousands of dollars on a dream winter trip to Aspen, waking up to fresh snowfall, stepping outside expecting a peaceful morning, and instead finding your car immobilized with a bright yellow boot clapped onto your tire like you committed some kind of crime. No warning, no note, no explanation. Just a cold, metallic reminder that someone out there decided they had authority over you. Now here's where it gets wild. The person responsible wasn't law enforcement, wasn't parking control, and definitely wasn't anyone with actual legal power. It was an HOA board member, a self-appointed enforcer who believed resort rules gave them the right to control everything from where people parked to how they breathed in shared spaces, and the way they carried themselves, the tone, the entitlement, the sheer confidence that nobody would challenge them, the ties. The kind of behavior that makes you stop and think, how do people like this exist in real life? But here's the twist that makes this story unforgettable. Instead of arguing, instead of losing control, instead of escalating emotionally, the person on the receiving end did something far smarter, something calm, something calculated. And when the police got involved, the entire situation flipped so fast it would give you whiplash, because sometimes the best revenge isn't loud, it isn't aggressive, it's precise, legal, and so satisfying that by the time it's over, the very person who tried to assert control is left scrambling to explain themselves. And trust me, hearing how this unfolds, how a simple parking dispute turns into a full-blown reality check, this is one of those stories that reminds you exactly why knowing your rights matters. Bro, when I first heard this, it genuinely blew my mind how quickly power shifts when someone who thinks they're in charge runs into someone who actually understands the rules. So yeah, if you've ever dealt with an HOA or even just someone who thinks they own the place when they clearly don't, this one is going to hit different. 3. There's something about Aspen that feels almost unreal when you first arrive, like stepping into a postcard where everything has been carefully arranged to look perfect. Snow sits gently on rooftops, the mountains stretch endlessly into the horizon, and every corner seems designed to remind you that this place isn't just a destination, it's an experience. And for most people visiting, that experience is supposed to be peaceful, luxurious, and completely free of stress. That's exactly what made the situation so bizarre. The trip itself had been planned for months, carefully timed to hit peak snowfall without running into overcrowded slopes. The kind of planning where every detail matters, from the rental property to parking arrangements. Especially in a place where space is as valuable as the view itself. The property in question wasn't just any rental either. It was part of a high-end managed community, one of those HOA-governed developments where everything looks perfect on the outside, but comes with a thick layer of rules underneath. Now, usually, HOA rules aren't a big deal if you follow basic guidelines. Park where you're supposed to, respect shared spaces, and don't do anything outrageous. Simple. At least that's how it's supposed to work, but sometimes the problem isn't the rules, it's the people enforcing them. And in this case, that person was someone who treated the HOA like it was a personal kingdom. From the very first day, there were subtle signs that this wasn't going to be a completely smooth stay. Small things, almost easy to ignore at first. Notices posted in common areas that felt unnecessarily aggressive. Warnings that seemed more like threats than guidelines, and that one specific name that kept appearing at the bottom of every message, a board member who clearly took their role very seriously. 4, still, none of that seemed important enough to ruin the experience. After all, most people don't go on vacation expecting conflict. You assume that as long as you're following the rules, everything will be fine. That assumption lasted exactly until the second morning. It started quietly, almost too normal to feel like anything was wrong. The kind of morning where everything is still, snow reflecting sunlight just enough to make everything glow. Walking out toward the parking area, expecting nothing more than grabbing the car and heading out for the day. And then that moment hits. The car wasn't just parked anymore. It was locked in place. A bright yellow boot clamped tightly around the front wheel. Impossible to miss. Impossible to ignore. The kind of thing you expect to see in city enforcement scenarios, not in a private resort parking lot where you're supposed to have designated access. At first, it didn't even make sense. There was a pause, that split second where your brain tries to process what you're seeing and fit it into some kind of logical explanation. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe someone parked in the wrong spot without realizing. Maybe it would be cleared up quickly. But then the realization starts creeping in. This wasn't random. This was deliberate. And just as that realization settles in, that's when the real problem appears, not the boot itself, but the person responsible for putting it there. Because standing not too far away, watching the situation unfold with an expression that could only be described as self-satisfied authority, was the HOA board member who had been leaving those notices everywhere. The kind of presence that doesn't just enforce rules, but seems to enjoy the act of control itself. The energy shifted instantly, you know. Fine. There's a difference between dealing with a misunderstanding and dealing with someone who already believes they're right. And from the way this person carried themselves, from the posture to the expression, it was clear this wasn't going to be a simple conversation. And that's exactly the kind of moment where most situations start going downhill fast. Because when someone thinks they have power, they don't just enforce rules, they escalate, they assert, and they push boundaries to see how far they can go before someone pushes back. And what makes this even more interesting is how easy it would have been to react emotionally right there, to argue, to demand answers, to turn it into a full-blown confrontation. But instead, something very different happened. Something far more controlled. Because sometimes the smartest move in a situation like this isn't to react immediately, it's to observe, to understand exactly what the other person thinks they're doing, and then respond in a way that completely changes the outcome. And trust me, that's exactly where this story starts getting good, because what looked like a simple parking issue was about to turn into something much bigger, something that would involve not just HOA rules, but actual law enforcement authority, and a very clear lesson about what happens when someone oversteps boundaries they don't actually understand. And the moment things started escalating, it became clear that this wasn't just about a car anymore, but it was about control, and who actually had it. 6. The tension didn't explode all at once. It built slowly, like pressure tightening beneath the surface, each second making it clearer that this wasn't going to be resolved with a simple explanation. The scene in that snow-covered parking lot felt strangely still, almost like everything else in the resort had paused just long enough for this situation to unfold. And standing there, looking at that boot locked onto the wheel, it became obvious that this wasn't a mistake someone was rushing to fix. This was intentional, calculated, and more importantly, backed by someone who genuinely believed they were in the right. Now here's the part that really stands out, because this is where most people would have reacted instantly. Raised voices, frustration spilling over, the kind of emotional response that feels justified in the moment, but rarely leads to anything productive. Bro, this is exactly how situations spiral out of control in real life. But instead of letting that happen, there was a noticeable pause, a moment of restraint that completely changed the direction of what followed. The HOA board member didn't hesitate to step forward, carrying that same rigid confidence that had been obvious from the beginning. Everything about the posture, the expression, the way they positioned themselves near the vehicle, it suggested authority, even though nothing about the situation actually confirmed they had any legal right to enforce something like this. And that's what made it so strange, because the more they acted like they were in control, the more questionable the entire situation started to feel. 7. What made things worse was the lack of clear reasoning. There wasn't a visible violation, no obvious signage indicating restricted parking, nothing that would justify such an aggressive action. And yet, the presence of that boot turned a simple question into a complicated standoff. It created a power dynamic out of thin air, one that relied entirely on confidence rather than actual authority. And this is where the real tension kicked in. Because instead of reacting emotionally, the approach shifted into something far more strategic, observing, listening, taking in every detail without immediately pushing back. It might not seem like much on the surface, but that kind of control is what separates a frustrating situation from a completely satisfying outcome. Bro, Hearing this part honestly made me pause, because it's rare to see someone handle pressure like that without letting it get to them. Meanwhile, the HOA representative continued to reinforce their position, doubling down on the assumption that their role gave them the right to take enforcement into their own hands. It was subtle at first, but the more they spoke, the more obvious it became that they weren't just enforcing rules, they were interpreting them in a way that benefited their authority. And that's a dangerous line, because once someone starts doing that, and they stop operating within rules and start creating their own version of them, the environment only amplified the tension. Cold air, quiet surroundings, and that unmistakable feeling that something wasn't sitting right. Even the way other people in the distance seemed to glance over briefly before continuing on their way, it all added to the sense that this wasn't normal, even for a place governed by strict HOA policies. And then came the turning point. 8, because once it became clear that this situation wasn't going to resolve itself through explanation or reasoning, a decision had to be made. Not an emotional reaction, not a confrontation, but a deliberate next step that would bring in someone with actual authority. This is where things started shifting in a big way. And instead of arguing, instead of escalating on the same level, the move was simple but powerful. Reach out to local law enforcement, not as a threat, not as a dramatic gesture, but as a logical step to clarify whether what was happening was even allowed in the first place. And the moment that decision was made, everything changed. Because suddenly, this wasn't just a disagreement between a property guest and an HOA board member anymore. It became a question of legality. And trust me, that's the exact moment where situations like this either fall apart or backfire completely on the person who pushed things too far. And in this case, it was about to backfire in a way nobody standing there was prepared for. The shift in energy became noticeable long before anything was said or officially confirmed. It was in the waiting, the quiet, controlled patience that replaced what could have easily turned into frustration. And honestly, this is the part where everything starts to feel different, because once law enforcement enters the picture, the entire dynamic changes. Authority stops being assumed and starts being verified. When the police vehicle finally arrived, it didn't come with chaos or urgency. It was calm, almost routine, like they had seen situations like this before. And that alone says a lot, because when something feels dramatic to the people involved but normal to law enforcement, it usually means one side has overestimated their position. Now here's where it gets really interesting. The officer approached the situation methodically, taking in the details without immediately jumping to conclusions. The boot on the car, the positioning of the vehicle, the presence of the HOA board members standing nearby with that same confident posture as if expecting validation. And for a brief moment, it almost looked like they believed the officer would support their decision. But that confidence didn't last long. Because once the officers started asking questions and assessing the situation properly, cracks began to show. The kind of cracks that appear when someone's authority isn't backed by actual rules or legal standing. And this is exactly why staying calm earlier mattered so much. Instead of a heated argument, everything now came down to facts. And the facts didn't support the HOA's actions. Bro, hearing this part genuinely made me pause, because this is where everything flips. What started as a situation where one person looked completely in control suddenly turned into the opposite. The officer made it clear, calmly, professionally, that immobilizing a vehicle like that without proper authorization wasn't something an HOA board member could just decide to do on their own. And just like that, the entire narrative collapsed. The same person who had been standing there with absolute certainty was now facing a reality they clearly hadn't anticipated. Because it's one thing to enforce community guidelines, and it's another thing entirely to take actions that fall under legal enforcement without having the authority to do so. The resolution came quickly after that. The officer instructed that the boot be removed. No debate, no negotiation, just a direct correction of a situation that should never have happened in the first place. And in that moment, everything that had been built on assumption disappeared. 10. What makes this even more satisfying isn't just the outcome, it's how it was achieved. No shouting, no escalation, no loss of control, just patience, awareness, and letting the right authority handle the situation. because sometimes the most effective way to deal with someone overstepping their boundaries isn't to fight them directly, it's to let reality step in and do it for you. And trust me, the aftermath of that moment was just as revealing as the confrontation itself. Once the boot came off, the entire atmosphere shifted in a way that was impossible to ignore. What had started as a tense, one-sided display of control had completely unraveled. Leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than any argument could have been, the car, now free, wasn't just a vehicle anymore. It had become a symbol of how quickly misplaced authority can fall apart. When it's challenged the right way, the officer didn't linger longer than necessary, but the message had already been delivered clearly. There was no room left for interpretation, no gray area to hide behind. The action taken by the HOA board member had crossed into territory they didn't legally control, and now that line had been firmly reestablished. And honestly, this is the part where reality hits hardest, not with drama, but with clarity. The HOA representative, who had earlier carried themselves with unwavering confidence, now seemed noticeably different. The same posture, the same presence, it was all still there, but something underneath had shifted. Because when authority gets corrected publicly, especially in a situation where it was overextended, it doesn't just disappear quietly. It leaves behind a kind of awareness, a recognition that things didn't go the way they were expected to, and that's what made this resolution so satisfying. 11. There was no need for further confrontation, no attempt to push things further or escalate beyond what had already been resolved. The situation had reached its natural conclusion. The car was free. The misunderstanding, if it could even be called that, had been addressed, and the balance of control had been restored to where it actually belonged. Bro, this is exactly the kind of outcome that sticks with you, because it proves something really important. Not every conflict needs to be loud, to be impactful. Sometimes the quiet, controlled approach does far more than any heated argument ever could. It turns what could have been a stressful situation into a lesson that is impossible to ignore. As everything settled, the surroundings seemed to return to normal, almost like the resort itself had resumed its calm rhythm. Snow still covered the ground. The mountains still stood in the distance, and life continued as if nothing had happened. But for those directly involved, the experience left a clear impression, because moments like this don't just end, they linger. They reshape how situations are handled in the future, how rules are interpreted, and most importantly, how authority is understood. And in this case, it was a reminder that just because someone acts like they're in charge doesn't mean they actually are. And as the day moved forward, one thing was certain. This story wasn't just about a parking dispute anymore. It was about knowing when to stand back and when to let the truth take control. 12. Looking at this entire situation from start to finish, there's a lot more going on here than just a car getting booted in a snowy resort parking lot. This is one of those real-life examples that shows exactly how power dynamics work when they're built on assumption instead of actual authority. And honestly, bro, this is something you see all the time. Not just in HOAs, but in workplaces, public spaces, and everyday interactions where someone believes their role gives them more control than it actually does. What really stands out is the way the situation was handled. Because let's be real for a second. Most people, when they see something like that happen to their car, would react instantly. Frustration kicks in, emotions take over, and before you know it, the situation escalates into something messy and unnecessary. And that's exactly what people like that HOA board member often rely on. They expect emotional reactions because it gives them an upper hand in the moment. But that didn't happen here. Instead, the response was controlled, patient, and most importantly, informed. And that's the key takeaway. Knowing your rights, even at a basic level, completely changes how situations like this play out. Because once you understand where someone's authority actually begins and ends, it becomes a lot harder for them to push beyond it without being challenged. Another thing worth pointing out is how quickly the entire situation flipped once real authority stepped in, and this is something a lot of people underestimate. There's a huge difference between someone enforcing community guidelines and someone taking legal action. Those are not the same thing, and confusing the two can lead to exactly this kind of outcome. And honestly, this is where things get interesting from a practical standpoint. 13, if you're ever in a similar situation, whether it's an HOA, a parking issue, or any kind of dispute where someone is overstepping, the best move isn't always to argue. It's to step back, assess, and bring in the right authority if needed. Because once things are looked at objectively, without emotions clouding the situation, the truth usually becomes pretty clear. Bro, hearing this story genuinely made me think about how many situations could be handled better if people just paused for a second instead of reacting immediately. It's not about avoiding confrontation. It's about choosing the right kind of confrontation. And that's what makes this story so satisfying. It's not just about the outcome. It's about how that outcome was achieved. Calm, calculated, and completely within the rules. No shortcuts, no overreactions, just a perfect example of how staying composed can turn a frustrating situation into a win. Because at the end of the day, the biggest advantage you can have in any conflict is understanding exactly where you stand.